The first thing I noticed was the way my sister smiled when I asked the question. It wasn't a joyful smile. It was the kind of smile someone wears when they already know the answer is about to hurt you. I had just asked the simplest thing in the world. So, have you and Daniel finally picked a wedding date? Sloane Whitfield leaned back against the marble kitchen island in my parents' house in Greenwich, Connecticut, and slowly lifted her glass of sparkling water. Then she smirked. We already got married. For a moment, I thought she was joking, because the alternative was something my brain refused to process. You mean you're planning to get married soon? She shook her head slowly. No, Carter. We got married 3 weeks ago. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears so loudly that I barely heard the rest of the conversation around us. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago was when my fiancée Olivia Harrington told me she needed space. 3 weeks ago was when she suddenly stopped answering my calls. 3 weeks ago was when Daniel Prescott, my best friend of 15 years, told me he was flying to Charleston for a family emergency. My throat went dry. Who did you marry? Sloane tilted her head slightly, like the answer was obvious. Daniel. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. My parents were standing a few feet away, pretending not to listen. But they were absolutely listening, because they already knew, and I was the only person in the room who didn't. I forced a small laugh that sounded completely foreign coming from my own mouth. You married Daniel Prescott? Yes. My best friend Daniel Prescott? Yes. My business partner, Daniel Prescott. She didn't answer that one immediately, because we both knew what that part meant. Daniel Prescott didn't just share memories with me. He shared my company. Prescott and Whitfield Capital had been built by the two of us from a 2-room office above a dry cleaner in Stamford into a private investment firm managing nearly $60 million in assets. And Daniel owned 45% of it. Sloane took another sip of water and washed my face carefully. You should say congratulations. That was when the second realization hit me. You got married 3 weeks ago. Yes. And you didn't tell me. We were keeping it private. I nodded slowly. Private. That was an interesting word for something that had just detonated inside my life. My mother, Eleanor Whitfield, finally spoke from across the room. We thought it would be better if you heard it from Sloane directly. Better for who? Because it definitely wasn't better for me. Did Olivia know? The moment I said her name, Sloane's smirk disappeared. Olivia and you had already broken up. Broken up? That's what she told everyone. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. Because Olivia Harrington had never actually broken up with me. She had simply disappeared from my life 1 week before the wedding invitations were supposed to go out. No explanation. No closure. Just silence. And now my sister was married to my best friend. 3 weeks ago. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. If you were standing in my position at that exact moment, hearing that your sister secretly married your closest friend while your own relationship collapsed at the exact same time, what would your first instinct be? Would you demand answers immediately, or would you stay quiet and start watching more carefully? Because what I did next surprised even me. I stayed calm, not because I wasn't angry, but because something about the timing felt wrong. Very wrong. Where did you get married? Charleston. Of course. Charleston was exactly where Daniel said he had to fly for a family emergency. How long have you two been together? Sloane hesitated, and that tiny hesitation told me more than any answer could have. About a year. A year. Which meant Daniel had been dating my sister for months while standing next to me as my best man during my own engagement dinner. Which meant every single time he asked how Olivia and I were doing, he already knew something I didn't. My father, Richard Whitfield, cleared his throat. Carter, we know this might feel complicated. Complicated. That was a fascinating choice of words. Because complicated was forgetting your passport before a flight. Complicated was mixing up 2 meetings on the same day. This wasn't complicated. This was calculated. But the real turning point came the next morning. Because when I walked into the office at Prescott and Whitfield Capital, my assistant Margot Thornton was waiting outside my office looking unusually nervous. Good morning, Carter. Morning. There's something you should see. She handed me a folder. Inside it were updated corporate documents filed with the Connecticut Secretary of State. I read the first page once. Then I read it again. Then I sat down slowly. because Daniel Prescott had quietly transferred 20% of his shares to Sloan Whitfield. My sister now owned part of my company, and the paperwork had been filed 2 days after their wedding. Suddenly, the secret ceremony made perfect sense, because this wasn't just a marriage. It was leverage. It was power. It was strategy, and Daniel had executed it perfectly. For 15 years, I believed Daniel Prescott was the one person in my life who would never try to outmaneuver me. But sitting there in that office, staring at the legal documents in my hands, I realized something that made my stomach turn cold. He hadn't outmaneuvered me. He had simply been planning longer than I had been paying attention. When Daniel walked into the office that afternoon, he greeted me like nothing had changed. "Carter." "Daniel." He closed the door behind him and sat across from my desk. "I assume you know about the wedding." "Edo." "And the shares." "Yes." There was no apology in his voice. No guilt, just calm confidence. Sloan deserved security. I leaned back slowly. "You could have told me. It wouldn't have changed the outcome." He wasn't wrong, but that didn't mean it didn't matter. For the next few minutes, we talked about the company like two professionals reviewing quarterly projections. But underneath every word, there was something else happening. A shift in power, a shift in trust, a shift in loyalty. Because Daniel and Sloan had changed the structure of my life without ever giving me the courtesy of knowing it was happening. And the most surprising part wasn't the anger I felt. It was the clarity. For the first time in years, I saw Daniel Prescott exactly as he was. Not my best friend, not my brother in everything but blood. Just a man who had made a strategic decision that benefited him and the person he loved. And maybe that was the real lesson hiding under all of this. Because loyalty is easy when interests are aligned. It becomes complicated the moment those interests change. 6 months later, Prescott and Whitfield Capital still exists. Daniel still owns his shares. Sloan still owns hers. And I still run the company. But the relationship between the three of us is no longer built on the assumptions we once had. It's built on something far more honest. Boundaries. Because sometimes the most painful realizations aren't about betrayal. They're about finally understanding the real motivations of the people closest to you. My personal reflection: stories like this often make us immediately choose sides. We instinctively want to label one person the villain and another the victim. But real life rarely organizes itself that neatly. From Carter's perspective, the secrecy surrounding Sloan and Daniel's marriage feels like a deep personal betrayal. The timing overlaps with the collapse of his engagement, and the sudden transfer of company shares makes the entire situation feel strategic rather than emotional. When people feel excluded from decisions that affect their personal and professional lives, the emotional impact can be far greater than the decision itself. At the same time, Sloan and Daniel may have viewed their actions very differently. From their perspective, they built a relationship and made a decision to formalize it, while also protecting their shared future financially. Transferring shares to a spouse is not uncommon in business partnerships, especially when wealth and long-term security are involved. Their mistake was not necessarily the decision itself, but the absence of transparency with someone whose life was directly connected to both of them. The deeper psychological tension in this story comes from overlapping loyalties. Family loyalty, friendship loyalty, business loyalty. When those three forces collide, people often make choices that prioritize the relationship they believe will define their future. Daniel chose Sloan. Sloan chose stability and partnership. And Carter was forced to reevaluate the assumptions he had built about trust and control in both his personal life and his company. What this story quietly reveals is that betrayal does not always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from people making decisions that make perfect sense to them, even if those decisions leave someone else feeling blindsided. And perhaps the most difficult part of maturity is recognizing that both things can be true at the same time.